Hello, everyone. This is recording number 12 for Aristotle, a class on the Nicomachean ethics. Today's topic is akrasia, that is Greek for lack of control or lack of self control. And I'm going to talk about how Aristotle discusses akrasia in Book 7 of the Nicomachean ethics. Now, the most straightforward case can be sketched by looking at two premises. And we can call them the appetitive desire premise and the correct judgment premise. So the first premise, appetitive desire premise, says that when an agent acts acratically, with lack of self-control, then she is moved by an appetitive desire. So what is an appetitive desire? For example, the desire for food, for drink, sleep, and so on. So for example, if someone were to eat a third piece of cake, that could count as acratic, given that desire for something like cake is a paradigmatic appetitive desire. But if someone were to be moved, let's say, by the desire to study Aristotle, that would not be a candidate for being acratic because the desire to study Aristotle is not an appetitive desire. Now, here's the second premise, what I've been calling correct judgment premise. It is assumed that an agent who acts acratically judges correctly what she should be doing. So, for example, return to our case of the agent who judges that she should not eat the third piece of cake. And then, nevertheless, she eats a third piece of cake. If that is to be a case of akrasia, it must be the case for Aristotle that the agent actually correctly judges that she shouldn't have yet another piece of cake. And we could contrast that with an agent who, let's say, makes the judgment that she shouldn't eat anything all day. And absent special circumstances, that would not be a correct judgment. So if an agent who judges that she shouldn't be eating anything all day ends up eating something, that does not count as acratic. Now, Aristotle raises all sorts of perplexities in Book 7 and sort of thinks through them. He does not lay out, as it were, an account of Akrasia, saying this is how it is. Rather, he's sort of puzzling through questions and problems. But I'm going to kind of leave it just with this most straightforward case because I want to discuss something that I take to be quite fundamental and worth thinking about, namely that he discusses Akrasia in the context of his account of the virtues of character. And that is, in other words, he discusses akrasia in the context of normative ethics. And I want us to think about that a little further by contrasting it with what is the most influential account in 20th century philosophy on kind of related issues. Donald Davidson published a paper entitled How is Weakness of the Will Possible in 1970. And he there, as it were, rejects both of the premises that I have ascribed to Aristotle. He thinks that we should be looking at a broader phenomenon. We should not think only of instances where an agent is moved by appetitive desire, but we should just look at, an agent being moved by any desire. And we should also not limit ourselves to cases where we assume that the judgment is correct. So in response then to his work, philosophers have been talking about agents who perform intentional actions that are contrary to their own better judgment or to their own best judgment, not assuming anything about appetitive desire or correct judgment. And those accounts then take themselves to be concerned with a broader range of phenomena. And in effect, they understand themselves as contributions to the theory of intentional action or the theory of practical rationality, not the theory of normative ethics. And I just want us to think about that a little bit further. Davidson says that Aristotle's account is moralizing. And we've already seen that Aristotle is not concerned with morality. So, in a sense, that misfires a bit. But nevertheless, I take it that Davidson actually captures something really important, namely that Aristotle is doing normative ethics here. And Davidson does not want to do normative ethics with his own account. So, what does that amount to? I just want us to remember that the discussion of Akrasia comes up in the context of this scale of 6 conditions that Aristotle is interested in. And we have already discussed the best and the worst, superhuman excellence and brutishness. And then in between, virtue, control, lack of control, or akrasia, and vice. So akrasia is the best of 3 undesirable conditions: akrasia, vice, and brutishness. And studying it in that kind of context opens up not just the question of what is going wrong when we act acratically, it also opens up the question of what is possibly good about acratic action. After all, it is better than vice or vicious action. So we might argue that according to Aristotle, there is something good here, not as good as control or virtue, but still. And what is it? Maybe we should suggest that what is good is that the agent does judge correctly what she should be doing. So that is an achievement to figure out what one should be doing. And the agent tries to do the right thing. And arguably that too is an achievement. So we might consider whether Aristotle, in discussing akrasia in the context of like how it compares to vice, is also interested in just, as it were, gradations of badness. And the difference between not even figuring out what one should be doing or not even trying to do the right thing versus in akrasia correctly figuring out what one should be doing and wanting to do it, even though in the end one fails. So I want to end with the question of what is gained and what is lost when we study akrasia, either in the context of normative ethics or in the context of intentional action.